22 years old when I came to prison.
I was 30 years old when I went to prison.
I was at the age of 19. I just turned 19.
Hi, I'm Chris, and I help life-sentenced men transition from institutionalized prison life back into society. Every one of our men has already served 25 to 45 years in prison. I serve on the board of the Corrections Transition Program at Everglades Correctional Institution in Miami, Florida. I teach these men life skills and how to speak, listen, and think, so when they get paroled, they become assets to their communities rather than liabilities of the state. Welcome to Men Going Home. I'm Chris Wolfe, and we've got a great show for you today because we are the only show that brings you access to a segment of society very few people know anything about. Men who have spent more than 30, 35, and even 40 years in prison. We'll talk to them about their crimes, their life in prison, and what transition back into the free world was like after all those years. Now, before we welcome our special guest, please welcome my good friend and co-host of this show, Andy Korge. Welcome, Andy.
Hey, Chris. Thanks for having me this morning. Our second show here, and last week it was really a very revealing show with Grover Cleveland Alexander. You might recall, for anyone that's watching this morning or watching this recording, you can always go back and see some of those shows. But I really learned a lot from our first show and eager to talk to Michael today. And I think what I learned primarily in that last show was, man, you've got to take a hardened shell when you get in prison. And Grover really, he showed us firsthand how he was a different person than that likable guy that just walked into the studio.
Correct.
And how he sort of turned that on and off. The other thing I learned from Grover last week was, there's a little bit of luck once you get out. You got to have a little bit of luck. And he luckily, hooked up with a company that valued his loyalty, valued his work skills, and he's been employed there since he was released for 14 years. So it was a very revealing show, and I'm very eager to meet Michael and get to learn more about his story.
Well, there's also a lot of luck involved in just the parole process. Not only just once you get out, but even getting out, there's some luck involved, because all it takes is one relative of a victim who shows up at the parole hearing and says, you can't let this person out, I'm afraid. And there's a very good chance you may not get out. The other thing I noticed about Grover is that we are all just one bad decision from incarceration. And the only difference between Grover and so many of us is he made bad choices and bad decisions. He's a very sweet guy. And it just, when I go to the prison, I look around the room and I see men, and so many of them, the only difference is that they're wearing blue uniforms and they made bad choices and bad decisions.
Yeah. And it was a great show. Again, if you are watching this today, you can always go back right here at the Miami Community Newspaper site, whether on Facebook, YouTube, and catch any of these great, really very, very revealing shows, as you say, that give you a look at a segment of society that really most people don't have access to.
Correct. Our special guest today believes change can happen, and that even a man who has committed crimes in the past can become a law-abiding and respectable citizen. Today's guest, Michael, spent a total of 43 years in prison after he was convicted of first-degree murder in 1973 at the age of 17. He was paroled in 2014 and is now a wage-earning, tax-paying citizen of our community, and he volunteers his time with Dr. Regina Sheeran's Corrections Transition Program at Everglades Correctional Institution and periodically speaks with students and faculty at various universities and colleges throughout the community. Please welcome today's guest, Michael. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Andy and Chris, for having me here today.
It's good to see you.
Michael, what's interesting is that I did a fair amount of research on your life, and I noticed that at age 8, you burnt down some guy's garage and you got caught. At age 10, you broke into somebody's house and stole $86 and got caught. At age 12, you stole a car at age 12 and got caught. At age 14, you actually organized and carried out your first armed robbery at a mini mart and got caught. and I thought, Michael, forgive me, but you weren't a very good criminal. Did you ever consider a different occupation?
Yeah, I certainly took up the wrong career early. That's for sure. However, I did get better as I got older. And unfortunately, I do regret it completely. But 40 other B&Es I never got caught for and things like that. But all those things I do regret, and I couldn't even think about doing something like that today.
40 B&Es. So then you committed 40 breaking and enterings or burglaries into houses, and you didn't get caught. So how do you get better at burglary at the age of, you were 14 to 17? How do you get better at that?
I guess you learn how to take less chances, Chris.
So, like what kind of a chance?
Chance to make sure people aren't home. Chance to make sure that you're not seen. Chance to have easy entry and quick exit. Those kind of things. Chances of, if you pawn jewelry or whatever, to make sure there's no trace.
Some of the men in our program, their role models were criminals, and they looked up to these men and they wanted to emulate these men. Did you want to be a criminal at that age?
I think what it was, Chris, is that as a child, I just wanted easy money, easy access to money to do things with, even as a young child. And I grew up with a great family, my parents, great morals, taught me everything, very loving. And I was the wild kid of the six. And I just, I had a wild bent, something that caused a lot of grief that I greatly regret at this time, but yet I'm so grateful that my life's changed and that I'm back in society living a productive life.
Talk about that. You said wild bent. What exactly does that mean?
Well, I've studied psychologically for years to try to figure myself out in different things. And there is a part of the brain sometimes it's not developed enough in people, and therefore they don't get excited at normal things in life. It just takes for them to go over the edge to get normal excitement, those kind of things. So, I didn't see risk. I took risks. Like, one time I stole some bullets out of a house or garage, and I was probably about 9 or 10, and I had my brother or sister with me out in the woods, on a stump with an axe to shoot one off, and things like that, that's just crazy and horrible and dangerous. But to me, I thought it was fun.
Mm-hmm. Now, you broke into all these houses. Were you ever afraid that you'd get caught?
No. Even with that wild bent kind of thing where you don't get excited, that type of personality, your emotions are kind of subsided. You don't feel the normal realm necessarily, or the heights of, the normal emotions, guilt, fear, those kind of things. And criminal minds normally suppress those kind of feelings anyway. And then over time, the pattern of being in crime and suppressing the guilt and the fear and those kind of things, does a number on your mind, because then, you're after a while, you want to change, and you just have to go through a whole process to retransition, because it really warps a person.
Right. You talk about the criminal mentality. The men in the prison talk to me about their criminal mentality. Explain what that is.
Well, it relates somewhat to what I've been talking about. A criminal mentality is a mentality that does not take responsibility right at the very core to live under the protection of the law, which means that I'd have to obey the law to live under the protection. Instead, I became a transgressor of the law. So then eventually they put me under the punishment of the law. I wasn't under the protection because I wasn't law abiding. I ended up under the punishment. And that punishment gets pretty tough over the years. It certainly wears at you. And it's a good thing because, we want to live in a safe society.
Now, things got more serious a little bit later. You were still 17. I make some jokes about your early life of crime, but I won't make a joke about this because this is very serious. At age 17, you decided you were going to rob another mini mart. And for some reason, and I know you're very sensitive about this because somebody was killed, and you're very sensitive about saying things that might offend the victim's family. In any event, you went into a mini mart with a loaded gun There was a gun there. The shopkeeper, the manager had a gun. For some reason, you shot and killed this man, correct?
Correct. I went in there to do a robbery. I had a little Saturday night 22 pistol in my front pocket. And as I was buying something, I noticed that over in a paper bag, he had a pistol. I seen the butt of a pistol there where he could grab it.
He grabbed the gun.
No, he didn't grab it. I ended up getting the gun. I shot him. And it was really just an absolute, the most I could say is just an absolute horrible decision, Chris.
Yeah.
You know, as I look back on it, there was no real reason to shoot him. You know, he was a man in his 50s.
Right.
And it's just a horrible thing. You know, I felt the next morning, I just knew something changed. And it was like something had been violated that was so deep or sacred, you know.
Yeah.
I just felt terrible about it.
And then 2 weeks later, this was, I believe, on May 31st of 1973, you got caught.
Right.
How did you get caught? Or how did they catch up with you?
Well, what happened was, as far as the crime, nobody saw. I totally got away with it. But there was a reward for it, and they were searching for the person that did it and that kind of thing. And what happened was I told someone that was actually not a friend, but I had a little partner then that was dealing drugs, and he drove that guy there to get some drugs, but I knew that he was going to go through the apartment out the back and rip the guy off. And I drove him there. So I'm part of that, so to speak. And yet I ended up mentioning something to him about the crime. So years later, you know, when I analyze it, I think what happened, Chris, is what was working on me, the guilt and those things that were suppressed worked out in a way unconsciously that I wanted to get caught. Otherwise, why would I have told someone that was going to run right to the police and as get back and get the reward, and boom, and then I was arrested.
It's you know, it's interesting thing, but I want to just, if I could for a second, take a step back, because you mentioned your family, and I know we've met before. I mean, you had what, 5 brothers and sisters?
4 brothers and 1 sister.
4 brothers and a sister, and so they all were kind of on the straight and narrow, pretty much. But you're the youngest in your family.
No, I'm a third oldest.
Third oldest. So. I mean, it's an odd, because your parents were just, you know, hardworking. I guess your dad, what did your mom and dad do?
Well, my mom was raising the kids, and my dad was electronic engineer. He worked in the space program. And then he ended up getting in real estate after we got to the moon. You know, years later, my sister had a professional career. My older brother was in law enforcement. My 3 younger brothers are all professionals, managers, engineers, and that kind of thing.
It's just interesting to me that you were so different than the rest of them. I mean, you grew up in the same household, right?
Yeah, it wasn't environmental conditions. You know, nature, nurture, the old.
Yeah.
And what you've said is you just had this bent to do things and push the envelope.
Yeah, I had this wild bent, and I pushed the envelope and just didn't have boundaries.
Are you still close with your brothers and sisters? How many are still alive?
2 have passed, but there's 3 left. And yes, I'm close with my family.
That's great.
All these crimes, did you ever feel any guilt?
Well, you know, you asked about the criminal mentality.
Right.
And I'm going to relate it to that, because what happens with the criminal mentality, and I'm not blaming this on that, it was basically my own nature, but it's congruent with the criminal mentality, is the criminal doesn't feel guilt. If he did, he wouldn't do it. Sometimes he may feel some, but he represses it. I did not normally feel guilt for the crimes that I committed. Now, I knew when I did the murder, it was something that was so horrendous that, you know, I said the next day, I just knew life would be the same, because I violated something very sacred. But still, as far as normal guilt, it didn't develop until later in my life.
Right. And we'll talk about that. That was when you were 30 years old in 1985.
Right.
And in your years of incarceration, you actually did a couple of years in reform school when you were in your teens, right?
Well, I did 6 months of reform school, 1.5 years prison sentence. I got out when I was 17 before I committed that minute mark.
Didn't you escape from reform school? You got a letter from an old girlfriend, and
right?
And you escaped and stole a car.
Yeah, she said, I'm done. It's over. So I escaped that night, stole a car in Okeechobee, and drove it home to the hometown.
Gotcha.
And that's the reason, actually, I went to prison.
Do you, when you go to a reform school, when you go to a correctional institution, do they do psychological counseling to help you kind of understand who you are, or did you ever get a diagnosis for any of this behavior?
Well, back in the days of reform school, they didn't really do that. I didn't see it. The prison system, to a limited degree, what they can and what they can afford, they do have psychologists. They deal with problems that come up, incidences and stuff like that in the prison. Sometimes you can get counseling, but it's difficult to get counseling if you're somewhat of a normal behaved person, because they just don't have enough staff to do that. However, I did see a psychiatrist, and I was very fortunate. Before I got out, I spent a lot of time with a therapist there. But when I was in the 1970s at Rayford, she diagnosed me with antisocial personality disorder.
Antisocial what disorder?
Antisocial personality disorder.
Okay. Well, all right.
And that's the kind of person that doesn't feel guilt. The old diagnosis for that was psychopath, but they don't use that anymore. But it's not the person, in the movies with the knife in the shower and that kind of thing. It's somebody that doesn't feel. They don't feel compassion for other people much. They don't feel guilt. That's the kind of personality it is.
So now you were apprehended on May 31st, 1973. Did they come to your home? Where did they pick you up?
Well, apparently they were watching me. And when I got in the car and went to the gas station, they just came from every direction and swooped in.
Gotcha. Did you plead guilty or not guilty? Was there a trial?
Not guilty, and I went through a trial, not guilty. I was convicted, of course.
Was it a short trial?
No, that being a murder trial lasted like 3, 4, or 5 days.
All right. And then you were sentenced to life in prison.
Life in prison, where you must serve a mandatory 25 years before you will become eligible for parole. It doesn't mean you will be paroled.
Correct. See, a lot of people don't understand that, because when I tell people I help life sentence men transition, they always say, well, if they're sentenced to life, why are they getting out? Can you explain that, how the law changed in 1995?
Well, into the old prison system, everybody that was sentenced had a year, years or life or whatever the sentence might be, and everybody was eligible for parole except those that were put on death row.
Correct.
And then when they changed, because of the crack problem in society and the escalating crime and those kind of things, and the get tough on criminals thing that happened to try to moderate this, they changed the law where inmates were not eligible for parole anymore, and they had to do so much of their yearly time, which now it's 85%. They can get some gain time for good behavior. So if you have 20 years, you're going to do 17.
Mm-hmm.
So all the people after me weren't eligible for parole, but since I had my sentence back in 73, I was still under the old parole system. Probably now there's about, out of maybe 70,000 inmates in the state, somewhere around that number, there's probably about 4,500 under the old system that are still eligible for parole. Well,
so talk about, you're 17 years old. You've been sentenced to life in prison. They send you to an adult prison. What was now you would spend some time in reform school. So for you, maybe it wasn't as shocking as for some other people who've never been, incarcerated. What was that first week, first month, or first day like? How can you explain that? You're 17 years old. Take us back to your 17-year-old mentality and help people understand what that must have been like.
Okay, Chris, you're correct. It wasn't as shocking because I had done 1.5 years in prison, and I put some tattoos on, looked like a tough guy and all that, and I learned the ropes and all that. However, it was devastating in the sense that my life had crashed. My life was smashed. I knew, had no idea how my life would end or turn from here. And I was going to be locked up for a long time. And I was just devastated on that part at that point. It wasn't the survival part because I knew how to survive, but it was just the devastation of having lost my freedom, what I did, and looking at life in prison forever.
So you ended up at some point, you spent time in various prisons throughout the state. So explain to people, you don't just go to one prison, and they transfer you around. And why do they transfer people around?
There's several reasons. So things have changed over the years. There's a lot more prisons now. There used to be less, so transfers didn't happen as much, but they classified people and put them in certain prisons because of the security level that they believe that person might be a threat, or because of their bad behavior in prison. They'll send them to a higher level camp. Then it was Florida State Prison, Union were the highest level, some of the highest level camps. They transfer people, though, if there's issues with people in a prison, they separate them. Sometimes they just kind of, turn over the population to change it in the prison. They don't want people being in the same job too long and, learning something or making some kind of connections and those kind of things. And then sometimes they transfer people for educational reasons, good behavior, those kind of things, to a little bit better prison.
How old were you when you were transferred to Union Correctional Institution in Rayford? Because that's one of the most violent and dangerous prisons in the state of Florida, correct?
At that time it was. I was 18 years old.
You were 18.
I stayed there for 10 years.
Right. And today that's the only correctional institution they do death sentences, correct?
Right. They used to do it at Florida State Prison. Now they brought it back to Union Correctional Institution. And there were 2,800 people there in that institution at that time.
What was that like? Help us. You're 18 years old in one of the most dangerous prisons in the country. And what was that like? Take us back to the 18-year-old mentality.
Well, the prison system was a lot different, Chris. They didn't have the security levels they do now. The inmates used to wear belts like electricians with knives and everything they needed to do their jobs, bring their thing home. There was access to get boning knives or get things grinded, or you could get anything you wanted in the prison. Major smuggling. Sometimes the free people would do it. It'd come in on trucks. It was just a wide open place. Unfortunately, at that time, I looked at it like a place to party. It was a very dangerous prison. If you had a beef with anybody over something minor, it could quickly, within minutes, escalate to a knife fight or a murder. That's just the way it is when you have a man in a prison with big egos and no real character hardly.
Did they guards and the people running the prison, because you said there was a lot of kind of smuggling of contraband in, et cetera. Did they sort of look the other way? Was it a way to control the population a little bit by maybe letting them take illegal drugs or whatever the case may be?
There were certain levels and things that they would crack down on. I'm not going to say they allowed it necessarily, but there were certain things they would certainly crack down on, and certain things that really weren't that important to them.
When Grover was here last week, and you know Grover very well, he described prison as like a pressure cooker, and that the correctional officers would allow certain illegal activity to go on because if you didn't, it would just explode. So
in the old day, it was more like that, like football tickets, gambling. They knew people were doing that. They didn't crack down that hard. They'd shake down if they caught the drugs. They'd take them, they confiscate them. Back then, green money wasn't allowed, but there were, thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars in green money because that's the way we did business, with each other. Excuse me. Mm-hmm. So it is a pressure cooker, and people do those things, play football tickets, smoke pot, drugs, whatever, to kind of relieve the tension.
Now, before we talk about your life as a drug dealer in prison, I asked you the question the other day, how did somebody survive 43 years in prison? Because people don't realize that the death rate in prison is very high, not only from violence, but from suicide, from murder.
Probably the medical care is probably not great. I don't know.
There's not a lot of preventive medicine going on. It's amazing how many people in our program have died either before they got out or right after they got out. So how did you survive 43 years in the Florida State prison system?
Well, I remember what happened when I was at Rayford, and I was probably there, 3 months, whatever it might have been. I met a few friends, whatever. Mm-hmm. And there was an issue with two other people about a cell. Back then, you could buy your cell and get it fixed up real nice. And then it'd be yours, and you basically could turn it over to somebody else. They don't do that now. But anyway, it was an issue over a cell that I had bought, and I went to confinement, and I told them, hold it for me. I got out, they wanted to try to take the cell. So I went to a friend of mine, because you can't let anybody take anything in there. And so he gave me a knife that was about that big,
Right.
So I
Bowie
armed
knife.
it was like a sword. So I put it down under my pants, I armed myself, and then I went and dealt with those two guys. I wasn't going for violence, but I stood up to them, told them what was right, what was wrong. I wasn't going to go for it. And they backed down. So then I learned from then on, if you have a beef, you have to arm yourself. So, I had a cell where I could jump up in 3 seconds, pull the thing out. The guards couldn't find it because it's covered with wires and stuff. It was in like the electrical thing behind the cell, get a boning knife in 3 seconds and have it if I needed it. You had to be armed in that prison.
And they back
not now, but back then it's different now.
They backed down because they knew you were armed?
No, they backed. Well, the reason I think they backed out was because I articulated what was right and wrong in the situation. But yeah, they knew.
And they reasoned with you. And
exactly. Because but I had to be ready to die for it. I had to be ready to die.
Right.
Because in prison, if you let somebody take advantage of you, you're going to be a punk, or they're going to take everything you have, or they're going to get your mommy to send money for them. And so you're just going to be used for the rest of your sentence. So either you stand up or you don't. And that's where you cut the chalk out.
Right. When we talked the other day, you said you have to be armed. People around you have to be armed, and you have to be willing to fight to your death.
Exactly. Yeah. And I stood up to people with knives and different things. And like I say, in those situations, even outnumbered. Like one time it was an altercation, and the guys had actually tried to rob me, and an officer had seen it come out. They ran. I didn't lose anything. I had a carton of cigarettes, but I had to find out who it was. And then I met the guy, and he had some big long pipe, and you can't really swing a pipe that big. So I blocked it, and then they went around, and all his friends came, and I had a Wall Street Journal with a screwdriver, which is not a good weapon. And they're all lined up down the road in front of the steel plant. And I had to walk through all those dudes like I had a gun or something, just to, to stand up. And then they didn't move, and I walked through, and then, you get your respect.
You said you had a Wall Street Journal and a knife?
Yeah, because I was studying the stock market. And I
Well,
didn't have a knife. I had a screwdriver.
A screwdriver. Do you think if it was a New York Times and a screwdriver, it might have been a better weapon?
I would hope so.
1982, you actually got sentenced to an additional 6 months because of a weapon they found, correct?
Yeah, no, it was in 82. It happened in 81. It was possession of a weapon. I got caught with a boning knife one time. As far as being armed all the time, you don't have to be armed all the time, but if anything breaks out, you need to go get armed, because you could be attacked at any time. You have to be able to defend yourself. That was back then. It's a little different now. There's not as many knives in prison, and that was a very, very violent prison.
When you were at the halfway house in Tampa, and Christian and I came up to visit, and you told me a story. You actually used to carry some kind of was it a liquid container with like acid in it or something?
No. It's like a little bottle like of lotion for your face, empty. Yeah. And they had Graphic Arts place or whatever, where they did blueprints in the furniture factory. They had this industrial ammonia. I'd get it filled with that. So it's actually a better weapon than a knife, because you can spray. I'd have that in a knife, try to get the advantage in case I had to fight. I never had to fight nobody like that. I had a few fights, fists, but I could spray somebody here or something and hopefully disarm them. They couldn't see. If it touches your skin, it burns you. So it was for survival. It wasn't because I wanted to be violent. I never used it on anybody, never stabbed anybody, never piped anybody, but I stood up when I needed to.
So all that time in prison, it was about survival.
It was, like
totally about survival.
Yeah, until I left that prison, and then it was more like a little college boot camp in a lot of the other places.
Gotcha.
Now, from 1974 to 1985, you were actually a pretty successful drug dealer inside prison. People don't realize, right, that a lot of this stuff goes on. You can buy pretty much anything you want to buy in a prison. But from 74 to 85, you were a successful drug dealer. And you talk about that. Drugs, money, and power.
Okay. So there's not a lot to do in there. The more money you have, the more fun you can have, the more things you can buy, the more things you can acquire or get in, that kind of thing. So basically, you control most of the money if you have the drugs. And the main drug back then was marijuana. And we'd bring it in 1, 2, 3 pounds at a time sometimes, not ounces in the small kind of thing. You know, they put it on a truck or something, run it in. Sometimes a guy that worked the back gate, we'd have 3 pounds delivered. The tractor would pick it up where they were mowing grass. They'd bring it there. The guy'd walk out with his jacket. They wouldn't shake him down coming in because he worked at the gate. He put 2 pounds on the jacket, walk right in.
But now, who brings the drugs in? Is the correction, sometimes correctional officers, sometimes the guys who drive ambulances, right?
No, usually it's inmates. Most of the time it's inmates, but sometimes, once in a while, there was an officer that was involved in part of it or knew about the truck coming in and he got his cut, you know, that kind of thing.
Wow. So, all right. So now from 74 to 85, how much money could you actually make on an annual basis selling drugs in prison back then?
Well, if you buy 3 pounds for $1,200, they're each worth $1,600. It might cost you one to get it in. So you $3,200 at $1,200. Turn it over, $1,200 outside brings $3,200 inside. You know, and then that's you're going to get some more later.
And from your drug dealing and your psychological background, because you actually taught psychology in prison, correct?
Correct.
You learned to become an expert at reading people, and you realize that people are weak. Talk about that.
Well, the people are weak comes in another way, but so if you're in a survival place, it's life and death. Most people learn different degrees and quicknesses depending on their conceptibility, how to read people instantly, especially if you're doing deals. You need to be able to read their character fast. Are they trustworthy? Are they not? The other thing about the character weakness that I learned over the years had to do with my experience in confinement when my life started changing in 1985. Right.
Yeah, before I get to there, I wanted to ask you something because you made a very good point about you being in prison and being on an ego trip. You said, hey, I'm making money, but I'm just a loser, you know? Talk about that.
Yeah, well, here I am. I'm an absolute loser in prison for first-degree murder under a life sentence. And I'm watching Miami Vice on TV, and I think I'm cool because I'm a major drug smuggler and dealer in prison that now I'm successful. I mean, that's kind of pitiful, you know?
Right, right.
When I look back on that.
All right. Now, big change, 1985. You're still only 30 years old and your life changed. You're in confinement, which for people to understand, confinement is actually a prison within a prison, correct?
Yeah.
Why were you?
You're locked up 24/7 in a confinement cell inside the prison.
And why were you there?
I was there because, again, it was a smuggling operation, 13 ounces coming in. Guy's brother was dropping it off. Another guy was going to pick it up the next day, worked in forestry. Somebody told somebody, they heard about it. They staked out the drop off. They come around and arrested all of us at 2 or 3 in the morning, handcuffed us, brought us to confinement for the conspiracy, basically. Now,
before I go one step further there, you told me an interesting story. At least with one of the camps you were at, there was an orange grove in the back. So what you would do is you would work it out where they would put drugs in orange tennis balls out there on the grass, and you were able to go back, pick them up, and that's how you got drugs. How did that work?
Well, that was Avon Park. And you know, whatever the situation is, if you're a good smuggler, you have to scheme a way to get it in safe. So they had a fire station right out across the fence that some inmates worked at with custody. They lived out there. So I was a friend to somebody that ended up getting put out there, and they had an orange grove out there. So when the visitors come down the road, I had them put it in like yellow tennis balls, and they throw them there in a certain place in the orange grove. And then before daylight or the doors open in the dormitories, my friend at the fire station would throw them over the fence. Gun towers wouldn't see them, or the trucks wouldn't see them. And as soon as they let us out for breakfast, everybody's headed to the chow hall. I'm going to the yard, collecting my tennis balls.
Picking up your oranges.
My oranges.
And you never got caught doing that?
No, never got caught.
Wow. Do you think you mentioned the psychology and learning about, you know, psychology, studying it? Is that what helped you get through prison, you think? Understanding that?
I asked him that same question. Go ahead.
I think it helped me some, but really what happened was when I got to prison after a year or two, I really wanted to change my life. So I thought if I get educated, study psychology, I'll figure out what's wrong with me. I'll make the changes. At least I'm here. Maybe I have hope of getting out someday. And so I got an A degree, almost got a bachelor degree, but studied every psychology book I could, taught human relations and some psychology under a lady that was there that had a master's degree for college credit for other inmates. But I never really got to the point where, although I wanted to change, I never got the traction to really change, the impetus, the power to change. So I went back to smuggling drugs, those kind of things, until that incident in '85.
All right, great segue. 1985, you're 30 years old. You've explained you're in confinement. All of a sudden, you hear the chaplain. He yells your name and gives you a book. Correct?
Yeah. Let me back up just a minute.
Go ahead.
So there were two other guys involved. Joey, that worked outside, was going to bring it in. He had like 6-8 months left. He didn't have much time. So his mom visited him on the weekend, and I heard his mom, and she was heartbroken. Joey, what are you doing, Joey? What are you doing? You're going to get more time. You're going to get another year. What are you doing, Joey? You know what I mean? It bothered me because now I'm thinking, I'm the one that organizes this stuff. I'm leading these guys in the wrong direction. My other friend, his brother, has a wife and a kid and got caught out there dropping it off. He may get probation or he may get a year. So, I felt like crap. And it was one of the first times where I said, man, you're leading people wrong. You need to learn how to lead people to something better. I had this feeling about it.
Looking back, you think that's the first time you realized you had a conscience?
I think those feelings were some of the first disturbing feelings of the conscience. And then what happened is, like you said, I knew I couldn't change my life if I tried. So I did everything. So I started praying. I'm in confinement. And I'm serious about what I do. So I'm praying. I said, God, if you're real, show me if this is really your word, this Bible, show me. Then the chaplain came one day. I didn't know till later, but one of the guys in there got out and told the chaplain, hey, this guy Mike's in there is seeking. So chaplain was passing out Christian comic books and stuff. He calls my name, Michael. I said, here. Then I felt this feeling inside I never felt before. It's like, this is your answer to your prayer. It wasn't mental, but it was like deep intuition that I just knew it was true. So he passes his books and magazines with a big, thick rubber band through the door. And that's basically because of a book in there that turned my life around. That's where the change happened.
What was the title of the book?
More Than a Carpenter by Josh.
And what do you remember? What was the main
Josh
point of that book? What was the main crux of the book that
Okay, the main crux of the book was, and I had read the Bible, but in history, it just talked about Christ, the disciples. What happened is, forget Paul, but the rest of the disciples kept preaching this message that he's the Messiah. He rose from the dead. We saw him. The authorities threatened him. If you don't stop, we're going to kill you. If you don't stop, we're going to kill you. Every one of them was killed, except John, who they boiled in oil. He didn't die, went to the island of Patmos. But so I'm thinking, this is impossible. And that's where the weak human nature comes in, because, there's people that have strengths and stuff, but normally we're self-preservationists. People are going to save their own butt. They're not going to give, there might be a fanatic in a bunch, I thought, maybe two, one, but not everybody. It's impossible. So what happened? What happened is he would have had to say, this is really me, for them guys to give their life. So that convinced me that, everybody needs their own convincing. That convinced me. I got on my knees, I prayed. And, I felt I had my experience, but what happened is from there, ever since then, my life started to change. I started working in education, helping other inmates. I quit all the stupid stuff.
So from that moment, how many years later did you hear about Dr. Sheeran's corrections transition program?
That was in '85. So I heard about Dr. Sheeran's program late '90s, because her program helps to get inmates that have served a long time transitioned into coming back to society, because we're prisonized in prison and take on the values of prison. So we need to be transitioned back for society.
Right.
So the parole board only paroles men in Florida that are totally prepared through her program.
And explain the concept of prisonization or institutionalization. Most people don't know what that is.
Okay, so prisonization happens that there's a whole different value system in there. You don't talk to the guards that much. You don't snitch. You keep your word. All these things. So either you take on those values to survive or you're not going to survive well. So you're prisonized by taking on new values. Don't show emotions. You got to put your guards up. Don't say how you feel. Be tough. You have to take all those values on to survive. And if you don't, you're not going to survive well. Well, that's not the kind of person the parole board or society wants in society.
Right.
So to let that person out that may have a good heart underneath if they really have changed, but still have all that armor and that stuff on, the parole board designed to use Dr. Regina Shern and her program that she developed to transition us back to society from prisonization.
So how did you hear about
resocialization?
How did you actually hear about the corrections transition program? I mean,
I heard from other inmates, and
Other
because
inmates.
people want to get out, and that this is the way they do, and they have this program, and if you can get to that, most people are getting out. And I ended up asking the parole commission. My family always backed me. Went to the parole commission, several hearings. They didn't let me out. Finally, though, they did send me to the transition program in 2000.
So you actually requested to be transferred, because most times the parole board looks at files and they request people to be sent. So, and explain as well, because people think, like Morgan Freeman in Shawshank Redemption, that you walk into a room and plead your case to the parole board. That's not how it works.
No.
They look at your file in Tallahassee, you're in Miami, and they look back to the original crime. So, so you actually requested to be transferred.
Yeah, what happens in a parole hearing is the parole commissions in Tallahassee, they have hearings there. There's local representative that works for the parole commission that comes and visits you, gets your information, sends it up to them. And then family or even advocates, victims, advocates, not advocates, but people that don't want you paroled, can also attend the hearings. So the parole board does ultimately decide who goes to that program, but you can request anything you want. Doesn't mean they're going to give it to you. They look at your file over there. They go through the whole process. And, in prison, we used to think, wow, they don't care. They this, they that. But since I've been out and I've been going to those hearings up there, those people do a great job. And it's very difficult for them. Sometimes they hear the victim's side and then the family of the inmate after 20 years later, and they have to weigh that heavy stuff out and make sure determination that if they did let this person out, that they'd be a safe member in society and that they would be productive.
You were eligible for parole consideration after 25 years, but you spent 41 years. You were 2 years as a kid and then 41 years on the first-degree murder charge.
Right.
So you spent an additional 16 years. How many times were you being considered for parole and you were denied?
I don't know exactly. I think it was about 5 or 6 times.
And why did they deny you?
They have different reasons, pretty much like seriousness of crime, different things like that. A weapon was used. They have different things like they got 10 of them or something. They pretty much apply it to this case or that case or that case.
Yeah, because you see, Andy, that's a big challenge for these guys, because here's a guy like Michael who committed a serious crime at 17. 41 years passed by, and the parole commission's looking back at this crime that was committed, 36, 43 years ago, and it's hard to overcome that, correct?
Correct.
How many years were you in the corrections transition program?
About 4 years. Chris.
About 4? Well, what's been the greatest challenge that you have had and other men once they're paroled? Now you're out. Now what?
Basically, there's been 2, and the first one was, I get out. I had some help from family. People gave me a little bit of money and stuff. But of course, I wanted to earn my own way. I did go to a halfway house, transition house. So the getting a job is the first thing. However, I found with getting a job, you need transportation. And to get transportation, you need credit. So those 3 things work together. I got no credit, no transportation, but I need a job. So I ended up getting a job for like $8 an hour, calling people to try to get a free roof inspection if there's been hail or something in that area, and save some money. I had Tony Padone drive me to work and paid him for it, gas. And then Fred, a friend that's very helpful in that program, he allowed me to get a car because he had a used car place. So then once I got the car, I did the calling job, but then I got a better job. I was just very fortunate as a courier. And then that courier job that was better money, I ended up quitting the first job I got into doing medical routes, picking up biological specimens in labs and hospitals all over, bringing them to a core lab, Central Florida, that kind of thing. And then, you know, after a while, I was working 7 days a week, 12 hours a day, making $1,800 a week. And I was like, wow, this is good. So the one challenge was getting a good job. Like you said, you have to get lucky, sort of, or fortunate. The other challenge was that I was not free in my 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. I got out at 58. So I had really no experience with dating, a couple of girlfriends as a, you know, juvenile. And so when I started dating, I had like a blank slate. I didn't know anything about relationships, dating, you know, and I had a couple of, you know, 10-month dates, you know, didn't really work out, didn't see a long-term thing in it. And then I ended up finding a beautiful woman about my age, and we've been dating 22 months, and we're getting married in about a week or two.
Wow.
Major milestone.
She trains me. She says, you need my training. I've had relationships. I've been married. She's a widow, but she's so good, patient, loving, and she trains me, and I listen.
Good for you.
You're right. You describe this as this is a big deal. This is a major milestone in your life.
To be connected. This is a major milestone.
Wow.
I've never been married or even been serious about somebody.
You know, you talked about the jobs you get. What are the biggest challenges with men getting out of prison after 25, 30 years, getting a job?
Certain jobs you will not get. I went to dressed up nice, went to interview for an insurance company. They had all of us sitting around the table, the guys talking, asking questions, blah, blah, blah. I had kept up with business and the market and, you know, everything in Wall Street and Time Magazine and blah, blah, blah. So I did great answering all the questions. They wanted me like manager or something. And then they said, okay, fill out this thing. And on the very bottom, it has, you ever been convicted of a crime? And I said, yes. So the next morning they called me first thing. Did you make a mistake? It said, and I said, yes, I have. It was over 40 years ago. And they said, okay, sorry, can't hire you. So certain
That's
jobs,
simple, just can't hire you.
Yeah, there's certain jobs you'll never get into with the background. And there's certain jobs that you can get into. And some people don't care. Like now I'm in a sales job and I do pretty good. And it's sales on the phone. They don't care. They just care if I produce.
Right. I mean, I remember visiting you at the halfway house, and the guys were telling me even construction jobs, the bosses loved them. They were hardworking guys. And then one day, loyal. And then the boss would find out that they had been convicted of murder or armed robbery. And he'd say, hey, you can't work here. So, I mean, is that just a personal decision of the employer, or are there jobs that felons cannot legally have?
It's both. So there's certain licenses you can't get.
Wow. Yeah.
You know, I did medical routes, but I wasn't working in a hospital. It'd be another whole situation. And then even later, the people who were doing the routes, I was grandfathered in, but they did background checks on those and they wouldn't let anybody in that had. So yeah, there's, you know, both.
Let's talk. You know, we've got a few minutes to go. Let's talk a little bit about your volunteerism. Dr. Sheeran believes that when men get out of prison, they have an obligation to give back to society. And I know that when I'm at the prison on Tuesday nights, you're almost always there the nights I'm there, and you volunteer and speak to the men. How do you help the men who are still in prison? I'm gonna go a little more general first, if it's okay. I'm not the same person I was since the change happened over the decades. I have a different heart with a lot of compassion for people, and I feel that I should give back because I took away and I gave so little before. And I want my life to count for something, you know, something small here. So I help kids whenever they need money, bands, this or that, whatever, and other things like that. And so I go back in the program to let guys know that, you know, you can make it out here. We let them know the problems we go through, that kind of thing, encourage them to go ahead and get through the program. You got a hope in the future. Those kind of things. I love talking to criminal justice students and telling them the real deal, you know, about prison and you know, criminals really irresponsible, worthless person. That's, you know, just the way it is. That's the way I was. But people can change. And that's what I want people to know, is that people that commit crimes that are worthless to themselves, their families, and society, even though their families may still love them, can absolutely change from the core and become respectable, law-abiding citizens. I'm talking about who respect the law, follow the law, want to be productive in the society, and want to experience some love. Right. Yeah, you sent me that quotation. Michael wrote this quotation: "A worthless criminal can over time change and become a law-abiding and respectable citizen." And you have.
Yeah, it's been demonstrated in my life, and I'm very, very grateful. Now, a lot of people helped me. I had good bosses in prison, supervisors in the education department, people that encouraged me, helped me. I spoke about the psychologist there at the end in the council. And there's been a lot of people, ministers, different people over the years. I couldn't have done it by myself, so I owe a lot.
What challenges have you had personally since getting out? And you're a success story, but I'm sure there have been challenges.
Some financial challenges at times.
Mm-hmm.
Dating, learning, that kind of thing.
Gotcha.
Finding a job sometimes when, one job closed. Things like that.
How about the technology of being in prison? And, when you went in, the world was a much different place than when you came out.
Right.
Was that hard to grasp? The internet, cell phones, all that sort of stuff that I guess didn't exist when you went in.
Yeah, and that makes good sense, but I kept up with those things by reading U.S. News Today, Time Magazine, and Dr. Regine's program. Those students from the college, from FIU, come in and they teach us about cell phones. Not that we get to play with them, they can't bring them in, but they teach us how to use them, what they do, Google, help us with job interviews and train us and all those kind of things that really helped a lot, where I didn't feel lost.
And obviously your spirituality had a lot to do. You mentioned you were getting emotional there for a second, getting me kind of emotional too, about the book you read and the minister that came to visit you in prison. I mean, that obviously had a lot to do with the change in your life.
Sure, because it was a very deep thing that happened. And that's what was needed, was a deep change. It started very deep. It wasn't deep. I tried to change. And, I just couldn't get the traction. I need someone to touch me a lot deeper than that. And that's where that spark started.
It's amazing. It's amazing. The other thing, if I can real quickly, you mentioned the parole board doesn't want you to have that prison mentality out into the public, right?
Correct.
But then why in the prisons are they having men develop a prison mentality to start with? I mean, I don't know. Maybe there's a core problem there in the prison system itself to sort of harden men the way they are hardening them inside prison.
Well, but the men become hard to survive.
Yeah, I understand.
So then what Dr. Sheeran has to do is, because they can't behave that way once they're out. If somebody cuts in line in front of you in the chow hall, you're going to punch them in the face.
Right.
But you can't do that at CVS.
Right.
When somebody does that. So she has to de-prisonize them so they can get along in society, correct?
Yeah, and to answer your question, so within prison, you have the guards that to a great extent control things, but they can't control everything. So then you have the inmate population that lives together 24/7. And that's where the survival and everything else is. The guards just look over everything, make sure there's no incident come. The guy that punches the guy in the chow hall, they'll run over there, handcuff him, take him out, put him in confinement. So they react like that. But it's the inmates that built the survival, prisonization, those, and it's pretty much the same all over the country and somewhat over the world. It's just the way prisons are.
Michael, when you speak to students and faculty at universities and colleges, what is it that they want to know that you tell them? What are they the most interested in?
I think what really amazes college students, and the ones that also came into the program, they have this idea in their mind about a criminal or convict as a bad person that's always going to be bad, which is true. The bad person that would be bad unless something happens, okay? But when they see men that their life has changed and they're normal people, like my brother or somebody else, and then they really get social with you and realize how you are, they're amazed that people can really change, and it actually gives them hope, because a lot of them are getting into the criminal justice field.
Right. Michael, you have been an amazing guest. I thank you always for coming down and doing radio shows with us and always being available for us. Thank you. Thank you so much. Congratulations on your upcoming wedding. You're a great guest, and congratulations on your success in life and transitioning successful. Thank you for being here.
And have a great honeymoon.
Yeah, we will.
Andy, thank you for always being here. You're a great host.
That was mind-boggling to me. I mean,
Yeah,
wow,
thank you.
how revealing that whole thing was.
Well, thank you all for tuning in today to Men Going Home. It's been a great show. I thank you guys. Please tune in next week. We've got John coming to see us. He spent 36 years in prison. He was a professional baseball player, and he got caught up in the cocaine cowboy world and spent 36 years in prison. And he will be here next week. Please tune in, and thank you for tuning in to Men Going Home. Have a great day. Thank you.